And so, what I want to do today is discuss gender identity in terms of the industry that's involved around it, and of course, has a stake in growing this industry and protecting it. And this is not something that Tanya and I discovered on our own. Of course, people like Jennifer Billick have been covering this angle for quite some time, and others looking at what's the institutional and basically stakeholders broadly described who are behind this. It's not what we see in the media and the public relations or propaganda thing. It's always the poor souls who have been stuck in the wrong body, who just want to live their true lives and be the woman or the man or the non-binary they always were, or the poor trans kid isn't being allowed to have their puberty suppressed. It's just, so it's very much focused on these kind of face cases on purpose to solicit our sympathy, to be kind. Whereas the meat of the matter, probably, and how we got here, is the industry part of it and the stakeholders that have been in that from the beginning or who have glommed onto it subsequently. So this is a ground clearing episode because we have, the more you get into this, the more you realize, the more there is to get into.
Yeah.
And so today, what I want to accomplish, hopefully, is just laying out how this is very much an industry, gender identity industry, or gender Inc., or whatever you want to call it, behind this push. And also then to focus on sexology and sexologists, because there was a sexologist who coined the term gender identity as it's currently normalized use today, going back, I think, in the 50s. So Dr. Money, John Money, who, those of you who are familiar with Miriam Grossman's work, or if you've seen the What is a Woman documentary, you are probably familiar with the role that John Money plays in this, kind of founding father, one of the grand poobahs of quote unquote of gender being something separate from sex, and all that has followed from that. And why that is, why it went from John Money coming up with this idea and running these kind of experiments on children and others, came
Right.
into what we see today as this multi-billion dollar and growing industry slash advocacy slash supposedly human rights movement, etc. So first, let's cover how we're going to be looking at considering gender identity from the industry perspective and all the stakeholders who are involved in that, and the various ways to have a career, to carve a niche, to make money, etc., from this growing, shall we say, sector of
Yes. Growing space.
transhumanism, although it's not normally discussed in those matters, although Billick is making a valiant effort to try to get us to shift how we focus on this issue. Anyway, so there's various aspects to gender identity as an industry. So, of course, the big one is the medicalization and the healthcare part of it. So, the pharmaceuticals. So, puberty blockers and cross sex hormones are now central to the gender identity industry. And these treatments often require lifelong administration, creating recurring revenue streams for pharmaceutical companies.
Yes, big money.
Yes.
Big money for your whole life.
Mhm. And I wonder if some people think that that somehow it's like a simpler process. Like you just go on for a while and all of a sudden your body just magically transitions from one to the other.
There was a forum for questions about the gender reassignment surgery, and it was a young woman, and she said, "After I get the pretend penis, am I going to be able to father children?"
Oh my
And the answer
gosh.
is
They really think that this would be like a real vagina or a real penis. I don't want to get too into the graphic things. I don't know what you can do with the fake penis that they construct out of your arm skin or leg skin. I don't know. I don't know. Anyway, so pharmaceuticals, obviously, the thing is, there's that it requires lifelong administration. Now, I'm more familiar with the long-term effects, and again, I wanna focus more on the money on it because I'm aware that if women who go on testosterone for a long period of time, a lot of that seems irreversible. I don't know
yeah,
what it's like for men who go on estrogen for a period of time. If they change their mind and go off the estrogen, what type of long-term effects there can be on that. Because some people get the idea that you just go off it and all goes back to normal. It's like a reset.
right.
That's why they like to call it pausing puberty
Yeah,
or puberty blocking. Like you just pause it, just a pause, you just pause and
right.
then just start whenever. It's like, well, I'm not an endocrinologist or any kind of medical
Mhm.
professional. Just on the face of it, that seems bonkers. But anyway, the point of this is that there's a lot of money to be made in the pharmaceutical end of the gender identity industry for those who go that route.
Yeah.
Okay,
It
so surgery is also a growth industry here. So we have the so-called gender affirming surgeries where they do what they can to rearrange your body to match your gender identity in your head.
yeah,
So mastectomies, genital reconstruction, facial feminization, and these are expensive procedures performed by specialized clinics. The growing acceptance and promotion of these procedures have created a very lucrative market for surgeons and hospitals.
totally.
Of
Women
course,
often
they do.
hysterectomies, right? They get for hyster procedures to get all of that out of there,
Mhm.
all of those organs out so that they stop getting gender invalidating menstruation. Yeah. They're taking so many anabolic steroids. It's poison. Doctors don't even know what's safe. They don't want to get their periods because that makes them feel like women, like duh.
Yeah.
So they get all of that taken out. And then,
Although some of them are fine with getting pregnant, which is weird.
yeah, that's the
But
weirdest thing.
anyway, but
That's,
that again, that's yeah,
that's
that
another
I'm
path for go
yeah,
for
I'm
it.
I'm gonna try hard to stay just on the industry side of it, not on
Yeah, yeah,
the
yeah.
contradictions and the
Right. But it must cost
magical thinking
a
side
lot
of
to
it.
have a for hyster procedure, right? Like that's not a cheap,
No,
that's like getting a mole cut off or something off.
no.
That's a big deal.
If you are a young lady, go in to have this so-called female to male buffet of procedures, you're gonna go through menopause.
Yeah.
And all the stuff that goes along with menopause, you're actively aging yourself
Yeah.
in that way
Mm.
because I'm already waiting for it because I always tended to look younger than I am, but now am I just gonna wake up one day and look 10 years older or some
It's
point?
yeah, it's like turning 40, right? All of a sudden you're like, "Wow, this hurts."
So, and then also the whole therapy and counseling side of it. So, therapists specializing in so-called gender identity have seen skyrocketing demand, particularly for minors seeking guidance about transition. All this stuff assumes that things have been established that haven't been established,
Yeah.
especially when you're in the realm of of surgery and pharmaceuticals and all that.
Yeah, totally.
So we'll get to where that notion of gender identity, how it when it first was coined and how it became increasingly solidified through language and surgery and policies and TV programs and all kinds of things. So a lot of people will go and yeah, and which is one of the things sexologists do is counsel people about gender identity and one can imagine. Anyway,
Yeah.
insurance coverage, of course, the lobbying efforts have pushed for insurance coverage to cover so-called gender-related medical treatments, further institutionalizing, normalizing, mainstreaming both this notion and the industry, of course. They reinforce each other. It's not just the medical and healthcare sector of the gender identity industry or gender industry. There's also the psychological, psychiatric, or sexology, advocacy and nonprofit sector. So, of course, we know of all the activist organizations advocating for so called gender identity rights, receiving significant funding from donors, often channeling these resources into lobbying, legal battles, and public quote unquote awareness campaigns. Public awareness sounds fantastic. Oftentimes it's great, but you have to be careful. Like, are you raising my awareness about something or are you indoctrinating me or gaslighting me or propagandizing me about something?
Right?
Yeah.
It's not like telling people not to leave their pets in the car in summer, right? Which is
Yeah.
public awareness. That's helpful. But telling impressionable young people who, according to my friends, all seem to be on some kinds of meds anyways for their anxiety or depression or ADHD or whatever, all of the things that I don't think my cohort had when I was that age. Telling these kids that, oh, well, you might be feeling sad because you're born in the wrong body. That's total indoctrination.
You haven't been able to articulate or to specify your particular gender identity. So, public awareness campaigns. And you see this all over the place. And corporate partnerships. So many of these organizations partner with corporations for visibility funding and to push so called diversity initiatives that, of course, include gender identity as a key component. Let's remember that what gender identity means in practice is that we go along as if there are male women and female women and male men and female men, which, of course, it's not the case.
Nothing else.
So undermining or blurring what used to be common sense and clearly defined things, girl, boy, man, woman, to throwing the gender identity thing in there. So now there's this unintentional, just born this way women. And then there's the male women who are men, who are males, but have something called a woman gender identity that is not measurable or objectively determined or anything like that. It's basically a claim. And since people seem to have this claim and have it very insistently, that it's become something that we should, affirm and recognize and incorporate.
Yes,
That's
respect.
what goes on. And I
Absolutely.
only know this because my awareness has been raised.
Maybe it's been raised by a pedestrian crossing in the colors of
You'll see
pride
things like,
flag,
if,
right?
I saw at Oxford signs saying, if you see someone in the bathroom and you don't think they belong there,
Oh, I
just,
hate that.
so now the women's room is for women or and for men who identify as women. It's like, what?
Right,
But they wouldn't say that. They would just say gender neutral or gender
right.
diverse,
'Cause
you
they
know?
wanna pretend that it's women who
Yeah.
are getting kicked out of it's masculine-looking women who are getting kicked out of you know what? My kid used to get asked all the time by little old ladies in the toilet, "Oh, are you supposed to be here, son?" And she'd say, "I'm a girl." And that was it. And then she'd go to the toilet, but they're trying to pretend that, "Oh, it's these poor women. You other women are bullying these women."
Yeah, like a main caliph. Anyway, uh,
Right.
yep, all these people can go out now and educate or consult. You go in and give courses or training or educational material for whether it be schools or hospitals or whatever about gender identity and
Right.
inclusion and all this stuff. So, consulting and training programs for schools, businesses, government institutions to integrate quote unquote gender inclusive policies, which basically means accommodating men who identify as women and vice versa. And people will always say, well, why don't you ever talk about the trans men, which is women? And it's just so hilarious. It's like, well, you can go ahead and do that. They're like the human shields of this. The trans kids and so-called trans men are the human shields of this stuff.
Yeah,
And it's so ridiculous. It's because a woman pretending to be a man has a different effect socially, politically, economic than the other way around.
for
It
sure.
affects her and it affects her family who feel compelled to go along with the quote unquote transition.
Yeah.
But anyway, side note.
Side note, and everybody
Uh,
knows it too.
They just think if you're coming at it from a woman's, rights perspective, a feminist perspective, they wanna be like, "What about these women?" Well, they're
I know.
women.
But you know what? I would like to hear if they have ever heard of a trans-identified woman, so a woman who pretends to be a man, moving from a female prison to a male prison. I would like to hear that. I don't believe it ever exists. They move men into women's prisons all the time, but they don't move women into men's prisons. Because even though they pretend that gender identity trumps all, right? Even though they pretend that, they know that they can't move this woman, no matter how she looks, into the men's prison. They know that and they don't do it. So if anybody ever hears, please do let me know. I'm collecting this information.
Or with
I should
sports.
know.
So what sport has a quote unquote trans man entered and where these trophy ceremonies where there's 2 trans men and a man in 3rd place?
Yeah.
That could be. And if they were smart, they would throw competitions every once in a while. Like, "See, look, we don't always win."
Weightlifter, like the New Zealander weightlifter at the Olympics.
Yeah.
What was his name? Where he just dropped the barbell like, "Oops,
But
I
yeah,
forgot."
so that's why we don't focus on that as much, although it's very much a part of this. I mean, in terms of making money, the women going in for these procedures are becoming a growing number. When it
For
used to be
sure.
very much primarily a male phenomena, what they call transsexualism or transgenderism used to be like 90% in males. Now, with this new incantation, it's been exploding, especially with teenage girls. And I think that most of the detransitioners, at least that I'm familiar with, are women who got caught up in this when they were teenagers. And then it usually didn't take too long for them to start having transition regret and detransitioning, realizing that their issue was that they needed to be treated like a boy and look like a boy or a man or whatever, that it was something else. Anyway, so education in public institutions is another part of gender industry. So you have school curricula, so educational materials, and a lot of what we talked about before with the advocacy and nonprofit sector. Oftentimes, the services they provide are for schools. So for these teachers who didn't know that there was more than boys and girls, or that boys could become girls and girls could become boys, they missed that in their
Yeah, really.
their coursework in their life have to be continuing education. But so school curricula, so educational materials promoting gender identity concepts and language are often created by advocacy groups or companies. So these materials are purchased by schools, sometimes by public expense, and used to train staff or educate
Right.
students. I don't know why it's just so crazy. I just don't know why there's this increase in kids identifying as non-binary or trans. I can't imagine. It must be something organic.
Yeah, they've all discovered it. Wow. The flash in the sky. We're all born in the wrong body. So funny.
Yeah. And university programs, good God, the rise of gender studies programs are often funded by grants, contributes to the ideological underpinnings of the industry, producing research and courses that reinforce this narrative. So, oh, there's this thing called gender identity. Let's go study it. They just assume and then study it as if it's something, or as if it's something consistent or coherent when it gets involved in the medical procedures and creating fictional gender identities and making pathways for people to have their sex markers changed on identification documents and all this stuff. Rather than it being an object of analysis and critique, they just participate. Oh, this is great. We'll go and talk to people and get consensus opinions and how people quote unquote experience their different gender identities with stuff.
Right.
And all of it does is it reifies, it makes something that is amorphous, fuzzy, subjective seem like it's something solid
Yeah, for sure.
and consistent.
For sure.
Of course, people have gender identities. Like,
Right. Look
what?
at all these academics. They're making everything about gender identity. They're throwing it even Simone Weil, right? Some guy wrote about Simone Weil from a gender perspective.
Yeah. You can look at anything you want from a quote unquote gender identity perspective because gender identity perspective can pretty much be whatever we want. So it's quite handy.
Like,
Oh,
you know, I don't want to get you sidetracked, but you're probably better to speak to this than me. But it seems to me it's like, have you ever been to a dog park and you throw the ball and all the dogs run for the ball, right? Like it's not just your
mhm.
dog. Like all the dogs be like, holy, this is great. They all run for the ball. And that's what this genderism is kind of doing, right? So they have this gender ball and the gender studies, the genderists go after it, but so do all the people who just want to stick it to university for whatever reason, let's see universities are full of Marxists and they're trying to queer your children. So everybody wants for the ball, right? The ball is genderism. And I just want to get the ball, just like stop with the ball, throw
Mhm.
the ball away. Don't bring the ball kind of thing. Why do you?
Well, higher education is also an industry, yes. There's the gap in our knowledge. There's a knowledge gap. That's why you have a proliferation of courses and books and documents. Now you'll have gender and economy, gender and sports, gender and
Right,
medicine,
right.
gender and media, gender in this, gender in that, or race, or whatever. You don't see class too much, but anyways, unless it's in terms of like lifestyle and anything that's replicable, that there's a market for, that there's also funding for, that there's jobs at the end of the tunnel for, are going to have more staying power. There's a lot of sectors involved in the gender industry.
I'm
Um,
sure.
Corporate inclusion and diversity initiatives, of course. So diversity, equity, and inclusion programs. So you have consultants, either you have people on staff, so your HR people have to become proficient in this,
Right.
or you hire people to put on these things that the staff love, I'm sure. Who doesn't love a gender sensitivity training?
No
Especially
kidding.
gender identity sensitivity training. Who doesn't love finding out about pronoun usage
Right.
and gender neutrality and workplace inclusivity?
Right.
There's male women now, and this is their truth. So these initiatives are increasingly required for businesses to meet these corporate responsibility scores that have come up, I think, the last decade. So all the metrics that a business or an association can be measured or scored, either by an NGO or a government institution, of course, they want to get a good ranking. And
Yeah,
if one
yeah.
of the ways to get a good ranking is be like, look how inclusive we are with gender identity. Look at what we've done here.
Right.
Check.
Yeah.
And I'm sure it's not just universities, but especially universities. It seems like their human resources does nothing else but try to get these stamps of approval.
Yeah.
So all these things like Christina Swan, Stonewall, blah, 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 blah.
Right.
And that becomes a major part of their work is making sure that their university can get these nice scores or certificates of, I don't know,
Right.
allyship, whatever it is. There's a
Advocacy.
reason why when people hear human resources, they usually are not like, yeah. It's like, oh,
Right.
what are you going to educate me now about?
Kidding.
And so there's also the brand marketing aspect of the gender identity industry. Many companies market themselves as allies of gender diversity, often producing campaigns or projects tied to, pride, flags, gender identity, merchandise, all this stuff. So
Really.
look how fantastic we are. Look how inclusive we are.
Banks do it.
And the thing is, this is not a bang for your buck. Yeah. You means you put on a flag, you say, okay, well, we're not terrible bigots who have women's rooms that are just for women. We're going to you know,
Right.
make them open to male women. And then
Right.
the only people that have to pay the price for this then are those of us who don't want to pretend that men can be women if they say so.
Yeah.
Especially when you get to things like we talked about last week, the nurses union in the UK who's upset that so-called trans women nurses are showering with them,
Yeah. I wonder why.
those bigots. Anyway, so
How they themselves to put out.
apparently, that union or that NHS has to get a better training program because those nurses were not sufficiently trained to accept 2 plus 2 equals 5 if, someone says it's their identity. Anyway,
Right. They need the Trunish Inquisition to come and
yeah,
swallow them out of it.
yeah. So the
Very.
5th part of the gender industry is technology and social media. So platforms amplifying gender identity, gender ideology, all this stuff, trans this, trans that, non-binary, furries, I don't know. It goes on and on. So social media platforms have become crucial spaces for the dissemination of gender ideology, concepts, vocabulary, products, love
Yeah.
bombing, affirmation, figuring out what you need to tell people to get the stuff that you want, how to
Right.
manipulate, et cetera, and also just planting the seed, getting people to think about, well, what is my gender identity? Maybe I'm, and so on it goes. And it provides community and all this, or to a certain extent. Algorithms creating influencers and movements that supposedly drive awareness and advocacy.
Yeah. Right.
Um,
If that Dylan character.
Evangelize, promote, celebrate, get clicks. They can become influencers and then get money that way.
That's
Maybe it's really true believers and they want to proselytize, help people get in touch with their gender identity and make sure that they're not unknowingly living in some sort of incongruence. Set
right. My God.
yourself free. Come out. You had a closeted gender identity, maybe you didn't know it.
Right.
Anyway, obviously, this idea and this notion obviously is appealing to a lot of people, which doesn't make it factual or true, but that is true. So, tech companies, algorithms often prioritize gender related content, fueling engagement and ad revenue. Tech companies also fund gender identity through grants, partnerships, in house initiatives promoting inclusion. There's also the legal and political infrastructure. It wasn't that one day out of nowhere, the Obama administration said, "Hey, we need to
Right.
we need to get this gender identity thing worked out." You have to look up the Pritzkers to find out perhaps why the Obama administration began telling public institutions, especially schools, they had to be more gender affirming and gender accommodating, etc. And not in
Okay.
terms of girls, but of people whose gender identity is not the same as the sex they were ready for it assigned.
At birth. Right.
Yeah. So this lobbying legislation also is a part of the industry. So advocacy groups and lobbyists have pushed for laws that enshrine gender identity protections such as anti-discrimination statutes and self-ID policies. So then it starts with tolerance. To be tolerant
Yeah.
for people who have this gender identity doesn't match their sex. Now people pushing like, no, it should just be self-ID. There shouldn't be any process involved. I get to decide if my marker on my license or birth certificate or passport says male or female, or I guess maybe they even have N now for none. Who knows? Again, people, everybody's male or female. Everyone. It
Every-
doesn't change. But us humans, with our imaginations and language, which is a double-edged sword, can conjure things into existence if we hear it said often enough, and if people around us seem to be going along with it, particularly people in positions of authority or surrounded with the accoutrements of authority. It doesn't take much for people. Maybe they don't buy it whole, but they're like, "Oh, okay, well, it's
Right.
fine,"
Right.
until it starts to run aground. So these legislative changes often require training, and then so once you pass these policies, then you have to help people know how to implement them, right?
Yeah.
The trainings to be in compliance. You don't want to be out of compliance with the anti-discrimination policies or inclusion policies around quote unquote gender identities
No.
and update infrastructure. And so this also keeps it going, which all adds weight to something that at its center doesn't have much weight. And what I mean by that is, of course, the pharmaceuticals are real, the surgeries are real, the doctors that provide these so-called treatments are real, the legislation is real, the tech company, all this stuff is real.
Right.
However, gender identity is an idea, it's a notion, it's a concept. So now you have another legal industry, yeah, especially in quote unquote gender related issues. So lawyers, of course, are going to make lots of money. Both, I'm sure there's already people who are becoming quite versed in these cases, whether it be people who want to oppose the bans for these procedures. There's money in that. And then we're starting to see suits with women who your gender identity is sex based discrimination, whether it be sports. I'm sure that unfortunately, there's not a lot of money behind helping women who find themselves in prison with the male women. I know there are some organizations that are trying to shine a light on that, but of course, the kids and the athletes are gonna get more sympathy. I don't think there's
They
any
really are. They really are.
in prison who are literally
Yeah.
contained
Right?
with the with
Offenders with the
Mhm.
convicts who decided that they wanted to pretend to be women. I mean, these men are convicts. They're not nice, sweet guys next door. They're convicted criminals.
But
Totally.
let's remember what we've been told by people who assume that anybody that criticizes this is just some sort of right-wing bigot.
Yeah,
Um,
that's just
this is just a culture war, and it's just divisive. They don't wanna touch it. Oh, like, this isn't also a political economy?
yeah.
Really? I
Cool.
understand why people don't wanna focus on this because it's just a shitstorm, but seriously, if you can't stand up for their men and women,
Right,
can't transition from one to the other actually.
right. They didn't have to fight it. They could have just said no. If they'd all
Yeah.
just said,
Nope.
nope,
It's
no,
just
we're not
amazing
for
to
that.
people who just convince themselves because they've been allowed to, that it's just a cultural issue, and that's when they really undialectical. So they'll be
Totally.
all base and superstructure, but not with this.
Yeah,
So
no.
if the base, which is the economy, or the forces of production, the relations of production, if they're what determine the superstructure, which is what they would put culture in, so that's determined by that and it shapes the other one, then how are you just going to pluck this out as if it has no relationship to that? How freaking convenient, you cowards. Anyway, it's just, well, first things first, it's one of those women's issues. So this, when it's a totally just unambiguously a class issue, that's okay. But this other stuff, especially if it causes them to run afoul, and I can understand it because people will come at you if you challenge this thing that
They
somehow
really
became
would.
conventional wisdom on the left.
But they would have come at
And
us a lot less hard if just some well-placed people had just been like, "No, you can dress however you want, but you gotta use the toilet that you're
yeah,
born to
yeah,
use,"
yeah. There's also
Made that a lot easier for a lot of us. They could have narrowed at the funnel head before it got yeah. I have a lot of resentment.
so we have some issue with the Marxists who pander or kowtow to this gentlementalism
All
as
of them.
if it's not real world harm and as if this is capitalist to the freaking bone. I
Totally.
just,
I'm mad
but
at not
whatever.
just mad at all of them.
We have Alexander, who we love. He's a
That yeah,
unicorn.
no.
Alexander McKay is and we mean that in a good way, not in the
Yes.
male woman way,
Not in
but
the true way, oh my god. It's even ruined unicorns.
but also Garrett, social populist. He's also a good one on this. And Tony, let's see. Oh, of course, media and entertainment. So mainstreaming gender identity in terms of the media entertainment sector of the gender industry, which is also big money. So television, this is obvious. Television shows, movies, books featuring non-binary or trans or whatever characters. They're it gets to the point where you don't know where the chicken and the egg is. Where did the demand come from in the ideological promotion? Yeah, and there was a point when you couldn't shake a stick without there being a non-binary or trans character on TV.
Totally.
Always sympathetic,
Totally.
yeah, usually.
Totally.
Always sympathetic. Various incantations of the Will Ferrell documentary with his friend.
My God.
Like, our
Yep.
role is to listen and to be accepting and affirming.
In order to escape from the nonstop grooming of English language entertainment, I watched a Korean melodrama, and one of the characters was a man who was born in the wrong body, wanted to be a woman. And guess who played it? A woman. They got a
Mm,
woman to play a trans woman. How
okay.
lame is that? Because of course they can't get a man, because no one's gonna feel sorry for a man who looks like a man. A Korean man, been to the army, probably pretty tough looking. No one's gonna feel, "Oh, poor guy," you know? These people, they're not as indoctrinated as we are. Lucky for them. They're gonna see the man who looks like a man, they're gonna be like, "Hmm, no, maybe I don't want him in my daughter's change room," like normal people like that, even on Koreans.
You can always tell who the people are who are being sorted into the ones we're supposed to have empathy for and understanding for. That's quite clear. And, and I'm not saying that's a bad thing necessarily, but getting people to accept or become comfortable with homosexuality is quite a different thing than getting people to buy into that men can be women and women can be men.
Because one is possible and the other is impossible.
Because
Yes,
if you're a
it
dude
makes
and
it
I find
sound
out you're
possible.
gay, well, then you're still a dude. You're just a gay dude.
Right.
But if you're a dude and you say I'm transgender, like, what if you're now a woman to be
Impossible.
recognized or affirmed? It's just funny. Well, sad and funny that we went from tolerance to magical thinking, affirmation, big sister, gender speak, gaslighting. Okay, so grants and funding. It's not that the research drives the grants, but the grants drives the research. So what there's funding for, you're going to have more research in that because that's what the funding's for.
For sure. Totally.
And I remember when I applied for a postdoc from the European Council, the Marie Curie thing, they were also all about gender. It wasn't just gender identity, but like gender in general. But you
That's
had to
right.
consider how your work contributed to that or would contribute to that in some fashion. You had to do it.
Right.
And I was studying urbanization of the outskirts of Maharashtra, of Mumbai, y- the urbanization of capital and political power. But that was not my focus. But yeah, so foundations and philanthropists and Bill and others have talked about this. Why is there all this money? Why are there gender clinics and centers for research and who knows what? Not always, but often funded by families or conglomerates that at the top have an AGP
Right.
dude.
Right.
Just FYI.
Like the
Um,
Pritzkers, right?
Pritzker is in the tech and medicine. So they have various interests.
Right.
The Pritzker Obama gender identity and legislation in the executive branch. It's an interesting story that Billick and others, I think, have tried to tease out because it wasn't like the media was covering it.
God, no. Why would they?
Yeah.
It's all organic. An angel from heaven who just enlightened us all about our gender identities, like not having a shadow. It's unthinkable.
And it's not a market and it's not a brand and it's not a lifestyle.
Kids are great. This is just natural.
No, this was something that's
No.
always been there. Look at Joan of Arc. Queen Elizabeth the First.
Yes.
The market expansion. Okay, the globalization of gender ideology has created new markets, of course, in developing countries where advocacy and medical treatments are increasingly exported. He was also chief of
Wow.
staff for the Obama administration the first time. He's from Chicago. He's in it with the
Yeah. He's
Pritzkers, and
awesome.
I'm sure he thinks he's making the world safe for male women. Okay. Women who just happen to be men. Okay, so there's the cultural impact. So, of course, the industry is a big part of the normalization or the mainstreaming of this notion of gender identity of women that just happen to be male to separate out female from woman and male from man so that people can live their true selves apparently. Or is it a disorder? Or is it a mental illness? It's all kinds of things. All of it and none of it. It's
Right.
fantastic.
Yeah.
Okay, so why does this matter? First of all, to understand incentives. There's a lot of money in this. There's a lot of money in gender identity. That's why we call it gender because it is an industry. Do you remember it was a couple weeks ago, there was some feminist Marxist, at least nominally, who was all up in my grill about calling it an industry. Do you remember that?
Yeah.
Like, no one calls it an industry. That's stupid. I'm like, oh, really? It's not an industry. Why don't you explain to me how gender hasn't become an industry? Of all the things to come at me from a
Yeah.
Marxist to get irritated about a
Right.
communist symbol in her bio, how is this not
Right.
an industry? It's
Totally an
like that was
industry.
the controversial part of that statement. So the industry, of course, sustains itself by promoting the narrative that gender identity is central to personal fulfillment and societal progress. It's not the money, that's just a happy coinkydink. All the money and all the jobs and all the careers and all the virtue signaling and all this, that, and whatever, that's
Yeah.
just don't look at that. That's just
No, no.
secondary.
Right.
It's really
About
about
the wealth.
yes. And that's especially where the advocacy and the media comes in. Kamala Harris writing Dylan Mulvaney a letter on his 1 year of girlhood, living authentically.
Oh, God. Gives me such a headache, that guy.
So there's conflicts of interest because you have the financial and institutional incentives raise questions about whether the promotion of gender ideology and all the stuff that follows from it serves actually these poor the people who have these. I don't even know what should I call it. Unique. Okay, let me think about my words here. So serves the quote unquote those who have these minority gender identities, or if it serves the industry itself.
Right.
And
That's
I think
good.
it's quite clear. We also wouldn't say that Coca-Cola is about serving the best interests of the
Well,
customer.
I
We
do
something
love the
like
Diet Coke. Yeah.
there's a lot of incentives far and away from making people from reducing the distress apparently that's related to having the feeling that your body and how people regard you and how you look are out of whack, or if you really just want to be a full-time cross-dresser and you don't want to be judged, or is it the money and the careers?
Right.
And then it goes so far that they can't go back. They're going to go back now and be like, "Whoa, whoa, our bad."
Right.
To sum up this part, the gender identity industry is a multifaceted enterprise encompassing healthcare, advocacy, education, corporations, corporate policies, and media. And its rapid growth is driven by financial incentives, institutional alignment, and an ideological commitment that all should raise questions about its impact on society and individuals, etc. This sowing this confusion that comes along with this push to redefine what doesn't need to be redefined, namely man, woman, girl, boy. So there's a lot of sectors involved in the gender industry.
There sure are. Totally.
And we are in agreement with Billick, who's been doing a lot of work on this. The business part should be really front and center.
Totally.
So the incentives and what's propelling this, it has very little to do with the well-being of
Right.
people who claim to have these different gender identities that do not match up
Right.
with their sex.
Worth
So
mentioning that the people who talk about this subject, the pundits who talk about this subject, but try to lay it all at the feet of some ideology or some religious experience, or sure, that's just the sauce, right? If they're not mentioning the gears of this gender industry machine turning and the money being made, then I think that's something to flag
mhm.
when it comes time to trusting people. If someone's going around going, "Oh, this is neo-Marxism," watch out for those people. Watch out for the watch out for the people who try to deflect. They're the opposite side of the same coin as the young woman with the sickle and hammer who was going, "What do you mean it's not an industry?" Right? Same thing.